Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Mark Torres. I'm an author. I released my latest book, Long Island Migrant Labor Camps, Dust for Blood, was released on March 22nd, 2021, and published by Arcadia Publishers and the History Press. Just some brief background. I am also a labor attorney. I represent thousands of hardworking unionized individuals and their families throughout the greater New York area. I have a law degree from Fordham University and a bachelor's degree from NYU in history. And this is currently my fourth book. I've written two fictional crime novels, a children's book, a labor union children's related book, and now my first foray into nonfiction historical book. And as you'll soon find out, I could not have chosen a more important topic to cover. The purpose of this book and this presentation is to identify the labor camps in Suffolk County during the 20th century, to discuss the impacts on the inhabitants of these camps and the surrounding communities, to introduce outspoken critics of the system, and to explain the factors that led to the ultimate decline of the camps. It's important to point out that this is the first and only book to cover this history, which occurred largely about 90 miles outside of New York City for more than half a century. Thus, much of the history was lost forever, and it was a great challenge to retrieve the research, through my research, the information I was able to retrieve. There were no primary sources, so I had to rely upon a review of more than 300 newspaper articles, scholarly articles, and government data, over 1,000 pages of documents from the Suffolk County Department of Health. I conducted numerous interviews. I studied several rare documentaries, which are critical to the research, and I benefited from the friendly and helpful staff at libraries, historical societies, and various universities. What I did find, and I could share with you now, is that the more I learned and the greater I delved into this history, the more my obligation grew to tell the story. And again, it was important to preserve this history and capture it. This story cannot be told without a basic understanding of the importance of agriculture, particularly on the east end of Long Island, with, most importantly, the rise of the potato. 19th century immigrants from Eastern Europe brought with them the skills of growing potatoes. By 1850, almost all of the over 5,000 farms in Suffolk County grew potatoes. In 1943, 55,000 acres of potatoes and 13,000 acres of other crops such as cauliflower, string beans, and a variety of fruit were planted. In 1949, the county alone produced between 14 million and 18 million bushels of potatoes, a staggering amount for not necessarily a large geographical area. And by then, a fully developed industry had formed, led by the Suffolk County Farm Bureau, which was formed for the collective interests of the growers. Here you see a photograph of a 1940 vehicle retrofitted to look in the shape of a potato with the slogan, "Eat Long Island Potatoes." Also critical to the story is the demand for labor. World War II created a nationwide shortage for farm labor. President Roosevelt signed the Emergency Farm Labor Program, and this created three distinct migrant streams. The West Coast and California produced the majority of the nation's vegetables. The Midwest from Texas to Canada produced the majority of the nation's wheat. And the East Coast from Florida to Maine produced a variety of crops. And for the purpose of this book and this presentation, the book focuses exclusively on the East Coast migrant stream. Suffolk County alone had a tremendous shortage. In 1943, a shortage of 2,700 farm laborers. Several attempts were made to fill this void. German POWs from Camp Upton were used, Chinese American immigrants from New York City, Boy Scouts, high school students, and Polish immigrants from the Displaced Persons Act of 1948. However, all of these are really a Band-Aid approach, and local farmers had to contact and rely upon the government for assistance. And the US government eventually contracted with the islands of Jamaica and Barbados to bring in farm laborers to work the land. However, by the late 1940s, the wartime program winded down, and Suffolk County growers then began to rely almost exclusively on Black farm workers from southern US states and some contract workers from Puerto Rico who enjoyed better benefits and conditions of employment because they were under contract. By 1960, Long Island had approximately 4,500 migrant workers. A majority of them were Black workers from the US South, as well as a smaller minority from contract workers from Puerto Rico. Here you see some photographs of workers in the field. The farm work, it's always been called stoop labor for obvious reasons. You see the workers bending, crawling, kneeling in the unrelenting elements of the weather. It's very labor intensive. It really, when I first embarked on it, I had no idea how hard and rigorous farm work is, but it certainly is both then and certainly still is today. It's important to understand the backgrounds of the relevant laws. In 1935, the U.S. government passed the National Labor Relations Act. This federal labor law allows workers to join labor unions and engage in protected, concerted activities to address or improve working conditions. However, both then and still as of today, agricultural workers are specifically excluded from the NLRA, and this left them extremely vulnerable without labor law protections. One attorney described it as they took the most vulnerable part of the American labor force and threw them out of the lifeboat. And also because many of these workers were coming from out of state or out of country, they had no voting rights to improve upon the conditions where they worked. With thousands of laborers entering the state each year, New York had to devise a place, particularly during the harvest seasons, to house and accommodate these workers. Eventually, upstate New York and Suffolk County were selected to begin using mobile labor camps. In 1946, the state passed the migrant registration law. This required all employers, crew leaders, and contractors to register with the Department of Labor. In 1954 and in 1958, Governors Dewey and Harriman signed sweeping laws to regulate all conditions at the camps. This included everything from ventilation, climate control, plumbing, heating, electric, you name it. Everything was covered under these regulations. And also, particularly initially, local zoning was required approval from the local residents. And a lot of the residents did oppose the construction of labor camps in their counties, largely due to racial animus and concerns about outsiders coming into the towns. However, eventually that waned over time because many of the locals understood this was a farming community and work had to get done. Here you see a graph charting the labor camps covered during the peak I've covered. In 1943, the first 4 labor camps in Peconic, Greenport, Kings Park, and Port Jefferson. In 1951, there were 28 registered labor camps. Just 7 years later, there were 134 labor camps in the county, by far the peak period. By 1960, there was a slight dip to 120 camps. And then each successive decade, the camps continued to decline towards the end of the century, and for reasons I will explain shortly. Today, there are still some labor camps, but they are much different than the era covered in this book. They are far more regulated and conditions certainly different than, again, during the period I covered. So what is a labor camp? The term itself is interchangeable. In short, it's a physical structure used to house migrant laborers. But of course, that varied. The larger camps had army barracks and small cabin-style units. They all had different sizes. They could have been shacks, rundown buildings, private homes, old barns, abandoned structures. And in one case, in Greenport, a historic mansion was once used as a labor camp. The general conditions of the camp could be best described from poor to terrible conditions. They always had a prison-like atmosphere. The workers, they were always in isolated miles from the nearest towns, cut off from society. No telephones, no recreation. The camps were always unsanitary, poorly maintained, and hazardous. Thus, they were dangerous. They had no security and no privacy. Many of the workers slept in what was called a bullpen-style sleeping area, which really was a large room with many bunk beds stacked next to each other. Not much room for space, let alone privacy. And again, because these workers were seen as outsiders from other locations, there was little public sympathy to want to improve upon these conditions. The first recorded migrant labor camp in Suffolk County was known as the Lake Lodge Labor Camp, located in Peconic, New York. It was a 3-story lake cottage with surrounding property. It opened in 1943. Approximately 100 farm workers from Jamaica, again under contract with the U.S. government, were brought in to work at the farms in the area. These workers were lauded for their tireless work ethic. They had extensive experience at working in sugar and banana plantations on their home islands. And seemingly, as they were described as tireless workers, and really produced high output. Within weeks, 3 other camps opened up: one in Greenport, one in Kings Park, and one in Port Jefferson. And all 4 total had about 400 workers from the islands of Jamaica. These workers traveled from Jamaica to New Orleans and then took the long train ride up to Long Island, and the U.S. government paid the expense, approximately $100 per person who was brought up. These camps, again, because these were under U.S. government sponsorship, they were heavily regulated, and the conditions at the camp were fair. However, they are short-lived. They approximately closed around 1947 after the war ended and the U.S. began to end all contracts with Jamaica and other islands. Here is a photograph of the Lake Lodge building. Again, you notice that's a 3-story lake cottage, but this was used to accommodate the large amount of workers in the area. By far the largest and most notorious labor camp, probably in New York State, was known as the Cutchogue Labor Camp, located on Cox Lane between County Road 48 and Oregon Road. In 1944, a group of farmers from Shelter Island and Southold formed what was called the Eastern Suffolk Cooperative, a company. And they formed this with the intention of running the camp. They purchased the land in 1944 and began the construction. The Army barracks were used, cabin-style units with military platform tents. This was one of the largest known camps in New York State, with the capacity to hold up to 300 workers at any given time. It had the only known school for migrant children. Helen Prince, a notable educator and historian from the town of Southold, was the teacher for more than a decade. There was also a daycare center for children of migrant workers, a Dixie Bell Inn tavern, and a small store that always sold goods to the workers, but always at inflated prices. Here you see a very rare photograph of the Cutchogue Labor Camp. The small girl you see standing in the middle of the road was known as Main Street. All the way to the rear, to the back, and to the right side, you see the large barracks where the single men would have been housed, again in the bullpen style sleeping areas. To the right and left, you see the cabins with platform tents used to cover the roofings for the weather. And over the years, and the way it would work is local farmers would come to this camp, drive up to this road, connect with the crew leader who runs the camp, and really just pick up workers, whether 5-6 workers would jump in the back of a pickup or jump in the car in a vehicle to be transported to the local farms, work for the day, and then brought back to the camp. And you'll notice that was the extent of the responsibility that the farmers had. Everything was basically outsourced to these crew leaders, and the farmers just had at their disposal a group of workers for each day, and they would just pick them up, have them work, and then drop them off again. Here you see a promotional advertisement from the Eastern Suffolk Cooperative touting the amenities at the labor camp, which you'll soon see were obviously exaggerated at best, at most. Here you see a photograph of Helen Prince in what was the only camp, again, the only school for children in a migrant camp in New York State. This was really nothing more than a large room with desks put in. Outside of this room was a leaky pipe with raw sewage, terrible foul odors, obviously not optimal living conditions. Helen Prince, again, a notable educator, would constantly lobbied for more funds. And she was always told, but Helen, you don't have to teach them anything. You just have to keep order. And it was that kind of indifference that's pretty much rampant throughout many of the camp operators throughout this era. Here you see a photograph inside one of the cabins. Notice the dirty bedding, the debris strewn about, the bare walls, no insulation, no fireproofing. These were very, very dangerous settings. Here you see another photograph to the far left and far right. You see the bunk beds. At least 4 people would have stayed in this cabin, quite small, not much room. Again, not optimal conditions. And over the years, this camp continued to deteriorate. It was featured in the 1960 documentary Harvest of Shame by Edward R. Murrow of CBS News. I would encourage you all, if you have any interest in this, to you'll see that on YouTube. You can Google that. It's called Harvest of Shame. And that documentary was aired on Thanksgiving Day of 1960 with the intent of shaming the nation for how this country treated the farm workers who really fed the nation. It was quite, and still is, quite a riveting documentary. It was also featured in a 1968 documentary called What Harvest for the Reaper. That was very interesting, not only to get an inside look at the camp itself, but to understand the economic exploitation, which I'll explain shortly, that was rife throughout this entire period. Again, numerous hazards. Bathroom facilities were always in poor condition and limited. In one case, there was 38 men staying at the camp, only one working bathroom. The bullpen style quarters, no privacy, and crime and violence were all too common. And of course, when you have conditions like that, tragedy is bound to strike, and it did. In 1961, a fire tore through the camp, killing 4 men. Leroy McCoy and Charles Jordan were found dead in their sleeping quarters. James Davis was found dead inside after he reportedly re-entered the fire to retrieve a new pair of shoes before being overcome by smoke and dying. A man named James Overstreet was pulled out alive. However, he succumbed to his injuries shortly later at a nearby hospital. The cause of this fire was that the 4 men snuck in a kerosene stove, which was prohibited. They snuck in a kerosene stove in the camp because they could not afford the 75-cent cost for the meals. A truly tragic tale of extreme poverty that led to the death of these four men, and quite frankly, a miracle that many others did not die that day at all. Over the years, the camp continued to deteriorate. In 1970, it temporarily lost its permit, was on and off for several years until 1983, when the land was sold, and 1 year later, the Eastern Suffolk Cooperative dissolved, almost 40 years to the date when they first formed. However, while they ran this camp, they also ran what was known as the Greenport labor camp. This camp was at the site of the former Richard Conklin mansion, built in 1862 on the North Road, just east of Chapel Lane in Greenport, New York. This was the previous site of the Kerwin Golf Course and the Soundview Stock Farm, which raised champion horses, including a thoroughbred horse named Raris, a champion of the time. Edwin H. King, a prominent grower from the hamlet of Orient nearby, purchased the land and leased it to the Eastern Suffolk Cooperative to run the labor camp, which it did for many years. In 1947, one noticeable incident, 200 workers from Mexico walked off the job. They protested the wages they were being paid. At the time was 60 cents. They felt it should have been more. A local hearing was held at a nearby school. The workers had no representation. The growers presented their case. The Farm Bureau ruled in favor of the growers, and the workers went back to work seemingly the next day. Seems like a minor incident, but it really was a rare showing of unity and a remarkable showing of unity for the time from many workers who come from Mexico, and likely many of them did not even know each other. So it was a rare showing, and it's referenced in the book. This camp was in operation until approximately 1966, when it was closed for good. Here are very rare photographs of the Greenport labor camp. The photo on the left, you can see barely through the trees the facade of the camp again, which was the former mansion. To the right, you see the barracks and structures that were built to the rear and side of the property, which was again used to house many of the workers at this camp. Here you see a sketch drawing of the Richard Conklin mansion when it was constructed in 1862. This, I could tell you, driving by, with the location of here, right across this would have been the Long Island Sound, a majestic location, beautiful view, and of course, very rural, and certainly for the time. The book, and again, one thing I'll point out, during my research, I sent a very large information request to the Suffolk County Department of Health. Again, I received well over 1,000 pages of documents, but all of those records really were dated from 1980 forward. So many of the records prior were lost, at least from their records. They either destroyed or lost forever, which is sad. However, I was able to retrieve at various historical societies a lot of this information. And here are some critical data. In 1960, in the North Fork, South Full Town had 24 labor camps with 630 migrant workers. In the South Fork, everyone knows the Hamptons, the beautiful beaches, but Southampton Town had labor camps as well, and many potato farms, and they had 13 camps with 260 workers. Riverhead had many camps, 30 camps with over 400 workers. Brookhaven, more further west, had 20 camps with over 300 workers. And Shelter Island, while it had 2 camps in 1960, it had what was known as the Beanery plant, which I'll explain shortly, in the 1950s, a very intricate operation for the time. Here is a migrant labor camp location map. Each dot you see here on this map denotes one labor camp. This was prepared in 1960. There are 120 dots. What is not shown here would have been to the top of the map across the Long Island Sound closer to Connecticut is very small Fisher's Island. It's actually part of New York State and South Holt Township. And yes, there was a labor camp there as well. I was able to find out through my research. But if you notice, you see the camps in the top left, which is more west. But if you get to the right where the forks begin, the cluster in the middle at Riverhead, going to the North Fork, and then below the South Fork, where you see the many camps that existed there as well. A lot of critical information. With the North Fork camps, some of the camps there were known as the King and Latham Farms in Orient, the Agway Labor Camp in Mattituck, the I.M. Young Labor Camp in Cutchogue, the Bowling Camp in Greenport, and mentioned the Fisher's Island Camp. And one thing I'll point out with the North Fork, particularly with the North Fork, because there's still a very fair amount of generational growers, I call them, the Wickham family. The Wickham family has been farming in Cutchogue for well over 300 years. They own a large property in Cutchogue, and I had the great pleasure of interviewing Tom Wickham, the current owner, And he explained in detail how they operated. The Wickhams believed in quality over quantity, so it wasn't so much profit as it was about doing it right, as they claim. And what they did was they used migrant workers. They constructed their housing for them on their own farms. So they didn't have to really deal with the crew leaders and these outside camps with the clusters of other workers. And what that did was they developed relationships over the years with many of the same workers, and that naturally led to a better relationship and better treatment of the workers. And this went on for many years. In fact, it still goes on today. However, this is in the minority compared to the many camps that were profit driven and really just these way stations for many workers where local farmers would just come, pick up labor, drop them off. There was no connection there. So it's worth pointing out. It is referenced in the book. And the book does have a very large index identifying at least over 100 camps. If nothing else, at least the name and location, hamlet, and township. But throughout the book, of course, the more detail on the more information is provided on many more specific camps. I mentioned Southampton, many camps, particularly in Bridgehampton. There was one camp known as the Henry Jacobs Labor Camp. This was a rundown home. Henry Jacobs was known to be neglectful. He was cited many times for the violations of the home, dangerous conditions. And sure enough, in 1968, a fire tore through the home, killing 3 workers. A woman named Myrtle Lee Grant. She was an epileptic and a mute, and she died with 2 others. And when the firemen eventually doused the fire, they found that the door to the camp, which was nailed shut, reportedly to keep out the draft. So they were in essence trapped and died in these conditions. Mr. Jacobs did face criminal charges for this. However, he died from complications of a recent surgery. So then case was then dropped. But the Jacobs camp was one of the more notorious camps referenced throughout the book. And several others throughout Bridgehampton, Watermill, Wayne Scott, and other locations in Southampton Township. Here you see it. And Riverhead, again, Riverhead had 30 camps with over 400 workers at 1960. And here you see a photograph of, and this is approximately taken late 1960. You see the general rundown appearance. All these camps were shrouded in mystery, well off the beaten path. In the middle appears to be an outhouse, which eventually was outlawed. But you just see the general appearance and the almost ominous tones to these camps. They were secluded and they were purposely kept that way. People were kept off the land. No outsiders were allowed. It was meant to be shrouded. And some of the camps here in Riverhead included the 8 Saxon Sons camp, the I Am Young labor camp, the Myron Nelson camp, the Fargo camp, which was on Laurel Lane, and the Zaylor labor camp. And again, Riverhead had tended to have many of the camps in general clusters within walking distance to others, but even them were generally off the beaten path, generally cut off from society. In 1950, Shelter Island ran an operation known as the Beanery plant. What they did here was they flash froze lima beans and cauliflower in great amounts, and they sold them to companies like Libby's and Birdseye. And you can see the operation here, the large equipment. They had a diesel engine dubbed Big Bertha. It was a very big operation, and they were quite lucrative. They used workers from Alabama and Carolinas. Even local women who lived on the island worked at the plant, but they worked indoors, largely more menial tasks. Here, the workers actually worked on the heavier equipment, which is, of course, always a danger and concern. There was no real training. It was just, learn on the fly as you go. And that naturally could, led to some possible dangerous conditions. This was a very intricate operation. The workers stayed at the camp, which is pictured in the book. It's an old barn on nearby Monantic Road. It's probably about 1.5 miles from where this plant was. And if there was ever any local local policeman named Peter Hannaberry would escort the workers to the ferry with a one-way ticket, told not to come back. They kept order in that way. This camp was in operation for probably close to 8 years. It was eventually ravaged by back-to-back hurricanes and then an insect pestilence, and that forced it to close down. If any of you do know Shelter Island, it's obviously a beautiful location. The Historical Society, right next door to the Historical Society where it is today, there's a vacant lot. That vacant lot was where this plant stood. I had the good pleasure of having a book signing event there just last month, and we were right outside, and I was just looked and kept seeing this vacant lot, knowing and imagining where 70 years ago, all of this took place. It was quite a remarkable setting. And in 1960, were 2 recorded labor camps on Shelter Island, but no records could be found describing them. Above all else, this is a human story, so it's important to point out the parties involved in the migratory labor system. I mentioned the workers, migrant workers, which came from Jamaica, Barbados, eventually Mexico, Puerto Rico, and then almost exclusively Black farm workers from the U.S. South. And it's important to point out because people often ask, they hear the word migrant. All of the workers referenced in this book were either on U.S. work visa, which is really the minority, and the vast majority of them were U.S. citizens from southern states like Florida, Alabama, Arkansas, and that really brings it home that what they were made to endure, which is a quite shocking situation. The crew leaders, they were perhaps the most villainous in this whole role. Many of them came from the same locations where the workers were. They knew where to recruit, how to recruit, who to bring, when to bring. And they naturally were quite villainous and exploited it. They took advantage, tremendous advantage, and had basically the lives of these workers in their hands. The growers or farmers, they outsourced all responsibility to the crew leaders. Crew leaders would rent the camp, and they would recruit the workers and control everything from pay to food to housing, you name it. Everything was controlled under the crew leader, and the growers had the advantage of just having a pool of laborers on hand nearby to use to help pick the crops. Also, the public, government, and the Farm Bureau all have a part to play in this sordid tale, and it's all detailed as I'll continue. So the best way to describe the labor camp economics is a cycle of perpetual debt. Housing, food, transportation, and other fees, hidden or not, or usually paid by credit with huge markups, were always deducted from the weekly earnings. Payday was always on Saturday nights, and many have asked where the title "Dust for Blood" comes from. In one of the documentaries, one of the workers was being interviewed, and he explained that on payday you get a check or an envelope with cash, and you always expect to receive a certain amount, and it was always much far less. The deductions, again, some of these fees were hidden or not, or fraudulent. One woman in Riverhead complained that Social Security taxes were being deducted from her check, but she did not even have a Social Security number. So it gives you an idea of the type of fraudulent activity that was going on. Wine was also used to control the workforce. Many of the workers were recruited for known to be alcohol or prone to alcoholism. And many of the workers complained or agitated, were very frustrated with working so hard and getting paid so little. They wanted to lash out. And many of the crew leaders who knew their tendencies would simply supply them with wine. Here, we'll talk about it tomorrow. Have some wine, let's sleep it off. And all that did was further the dependency and the fogginess of the workers, and it just perpetuated the entire system. One of the largest problems was that there was no pay during work stoppages. So if a worker is earning $1.35 an hour for an 8-hour day, that's $10.80. However, many of the workers, if they worked at a potato processing plant, many did. If there was machine failure for 4 hours, the workers would have to remain on the site until the machines are finished. So they would be there for 8 hours, but actually work and be paid for 4 hours. So that cut the daily pay in half. And all along, the workers are still incurring the daily debt of living and staying at the camps. Again, a cycle of perpetual debt. They're always chasing this debt. Workers who complained faced retaliation, in some cases, including no work. A crew leader who wanted to be punitive would simply say, well, John, you're going to stay back. You're not going to work for 3 or 4 days. So John would stay at the camp, not earn an income, but still earn the debt of staying at the camp. And again, he would fall deeper and deeper into debt. Or there were worse scenarios. In 1968, a crew leader known as Isaiah Moore at the Cutchog labor camp. There were 4 workers who were huddled in one of the cabins. They claimed they were not feeling well. They were sick. Isaiah Moore didn't believe him. He thought they would just didn't want to work, and it was costing him money and time. And what he did was he disconnected the fuel line that supplied the heat to the cabin. Well, within 3 weeks, 3 of those 4 workers died from pneumonia, because it gives you an indication of the retaliatory conducts and what can happen from that. Theft, violence, manipulation, and exploitation were all too common in this history. And the exploitation by the crew leaders, it starts at the early stage, recruitment. People and workers were preyed upon. They preyed upon vulnerable transients, adults, and children. They were luring them with false promises of the ability to earn so much money on Long Island, great location. And in some cases, workers were taken by force, a term known as Shanghai. Carl Beeman was one of these crew leaders, and he drove around a notorious rusty bus they call it the Red Bus. And he would go to inner cities, homeless shelters, bars where people were passed out on the street, put them in the van, put them in the bus, bring them to Long Island, and next they wake up unawares of where they are. And that's the term known as Shanghai. 15-year-old Alfonso Mahone, a boy from Macon, Georgia. He was lured by a crew leader to come up to Long Island. He worked at 2 labor camps in Bridgehampton. This was in 1968. 15-year-old Mahone, he worked at 2 camps at a potato processing plant. He hurt his hand. When he complained and then asked for treatment, they denied it to him. When he complained further, they fired him and evicted him from the camp. He had to walk the 30 plus miles or find his way to Riverhead, where a nonprofit group eventually secured a ride home for him. And the Department of Labor did step in and recruit and secure the money that was owed to him. But as bad as that scenario sounds, that was actually a success story, because many of the workers had no way home and certainly had no way to retrieve the monies without any assistance. In short, the crew leaders exerted full control over the lives of the workers. Another example, Andrew Anderson at the Cutchogue labor camp. His exploits are in full view in the documentary What Harvest for the Reaper. Everything, and he was more of the suave type, and others were more abusive. I mentioned Carl Beeman. He was known to beat his workers with a skillet or a stick. In one instance, he locked a man named Frank Singleton, who was known to have a mental deficiency. He locked Frank in a room at the camp to take care of Beeman's sick wife, just forcing him to do that. James Brown of Mattituck, he was charged with stealing $400 in wages from a group of workers and running a camp without a license. James Colville in Riverhead, he was charged with beating workers with the hammer and his fists. Ernest Mitchell in Riverhead also went by the alias of Charlie Sapp. Over 6 foot, all over 400 pounds, a very intimidating figure. He always had a vicious German Shepherd dog named Duke at his side that he did not hesitate to stick on the workers to bite them, to instill fear or just instill pain. And he was charged with beating male and female farm workers, theft, and also tax evasion. These are the men who controlled the lives of many people for many years on Long Island with impunity, seemingly with impunity. The book also delves into the toll in the life of the migrant worker, the psychological effects. Again, we talked about the isolation and the boredom. The camps are located miles from the nearest town centers. There was little to no recreation. Almost none of the camps had phones. Because these workers were seen as outsiders, there was little desire for the public to help, and many who came alone had no family support while they were here. No privacy. This left them prone to theft, bullying, violence, harassment, and sexual abuse. In 1970, the Newsday reporter Les Payne spent 1 week undercover at a labor camp in Riverhead. He spoke extensively about the conditions there and also about the alcohol abuse. He explained that wine was the lifeblood of the migrant worker. Again, I mentioned earlier about the hazards and rigors of farm labor. The book goes into this. It discusses the national level, there was low life expectancy and high infant mortality rate. Again, it was dangerous and hard work, stoop labor. They're out there facing weather-related maladies and hazardous travel conditions. Much of this occurred prior to the banning of DDT, so many of the workers undoubtedly faced pesticide-related illnesses. There was also infectious diseases like tuberculosis and sexually transmitted diseases at the camps. And in many cases, there was, because there was little access to adequate health care, it led to unfortunate suffering and even death. In 1956, a man named Arthur Drew in Mattituck was found dead alongside the road from pneumonia. 1965, Willie Jeff Lawrence, also in Mattituck. He died from a fractured skull he received after being attacked 1 week earlier. He walked around for 1 week with a fractured skull before dying. James Biddle, 1969, in Riverhead. He was found dead of a liver condition the day after he went to the hospital to complain about it. He was not admitted, sent back to the camp. That evening in his sleep, he perished. The autopsy showed he died of a faulty liver. 1971, Pedro Fuentes, also in Riverhead. He was a known epileptic. He had a seizure traveling between 2 camps, and his frozen body was found dead behind a rotted tree. All of these deaths could have been preventable if there was access to some basic health care, and sadly, there wasn't. And of course, the book delves into the travel dangers, which were extensive, not only traveling interstate from southern states all the way up to Long Island, but also locally on Long Island. There are many examples of accidents detailed in the book, multiple fatalities, tragic events that occurred. And at the time, only 6 states had transportation laws for migrant workers. So it truly was a really dangerous time for many of these workers. Here you see workers working on a potato combine. And also I'll point out that, again, there was never much training or, certainly there was no training. It was just kind of learn as you go. And many of these workers did have experience in working different locations, but that in no way lessened the dangers they faced. In 1970, the accident rate of farm work was 3 times higher than any other industry. And by 1980, farm work was deemed more dangerous than mining, which is really incredible. Everyone knows the dangers of mining. Many cases, there were lost limbs, fingers, toes. Prior to 1965, these workers had no access to workman's compensation. So if they lost a toe, a foot, an arm, they had to sue in court to get money. And without assistance, that just wouldn't happen. Truly was a tragic circumstance. Here you see some photograph of some workers, and you notice the low railing on the truck. Clearly, if this truck was going fast enough in order to take a turn, many or all of these workers could have easily toppled over, seriously injured, if not killed. And of course, when you cram people in dangerous slum-like conditions and exploit them physically and economically, crime and violence are natural results. I'll quote Reverend Arthur Bryant, a Reverend of Greenport in 1969, who stated, "Camp life is lawless. Rusty guns and shiny knives appear frequently. Police seldom patrol, and a number of camps do not even have telephones so that a man may call the cops if he feels that he is being bullied." Criminal activity at the camps were widespread. Theft, beatings, stabbings, gun violence, sexual abuse went on continuously. One incident occurred in 1955. One worker, there was a dispute. A man stabbed him in the chest with a knife. He fled into the nearby woods to escape. He was caught up with police. He admitted to the killing and was apparently set to do time. A short time later, he was out, and his name was, at the time, he became the blues artist known as Son House. He was able to resurrect his musical career after this incident. And again, the criminal activity was rampant not only within the camps, but also around the camps and throughout the surrounding communities. And this had tremendous effects on the economy, the community, and first responders. During my research, I interviewed Joseph Grattan, the retired police chief from Riverhead at the time. And he took me around. He showed me a lot of the locations and the places, a really important part of my research. And he explained, of course, back then there were no cell phones, there were call boxes. And he said, if you ran into trouble and could not find a call box, you had two options: either talk your way out of trouble or fight your way out of trouble. That's a remarkable statement from a police chief of the time, but it gives you an understanding of the rampant crime and violence that was on as a byproduct of these conditions. Riverhead is quite important in the story. It was and still is the largest eastern municipal city. And by 1960, it had, between Riverhead and Southold, it contained 60% of the camps and 70% of the total workers. So many of the workers who were going to stay and reside in the area did so in Riverhead. And the reason why it was easier to do that was because Riverhead had no housing code at the time. Anyone could put up any structure and call it a home and live there. This had, as you'll soon see, tremendous catastrophic consequences. Not only did it give rise to poverty-stricken areas known as the Bottoms, the Queens, and other areas, but there was much crime, suffering, and death from that. And also, the duck industry at the time was winding down largely due to environmental concerns. And Hollis Warner, who had one of the largest duck farms in the nation in Riverhead, was converting his buildings that he used to house ducks to make them rentable space that he rented out to migrant workers and those impoverished. Again, because there was no housing code, he was able to do this. And again, this also had a high impact on the county economy and the first responders. Here you can see a photograph of an abandoned shack in the Riverhead at one of the locations known as the Bottoms at the time. Here you see what was known as a duck brooder building, B-R-O-O-D-E-R. Buildings like this were used to house the thousands and thousands of duck hatchlings that were produced each year. Here's a photograph inside with those ducks. Hollis Warner would have converted a property like this. He would have partitioned off with the beams. You see the beams coming down to the back wall. He would have partitioned these off and rented them out as livable space to those who were destitute and nowhere else to go. Again, there was no housing code. He was allowed to do this, and it had tremendous consequences. Of course, there was terrible foul odors, insects, no running water, really terrible consequences. And his duck farm really was in a secluded place. In fact, it's where Indian Island State Park is today. There's a nearby golf course. All of that belonged to one man named Hollis Warner, who had that duck farm and then converted them to rentable space for that. And just by way of statistics regarding the settlement of Riverhead, in 1960, 1,000 workers settled in the area. By 1970, 1,600 workers settled. So the numbers were increasing throughout this time, and many of them stayed in areas like this. And of course, and I'll read a quote from Ruth Shire from the Suffolk County News in 1956, who said, "When you crowd people in unsuitable quarters with inadequate facilities, tragedy is bound to strike," and it did. Even the most hostile communities can no longer feel complacent when they contemplate the charred bodies of children who have been trapped in dwellings away from good water pressure. There were many cases of death, men, women, and children who perished in this history from negligence, poverty, misfortune. I think of poor Dilcia Trent, a 22-year-old mother of 3 children, all under the age of 3. The family was living in a 12-foot by 12-foot shack in Riverhead. It was 1959. It was a January day, cold day. She went to light a kerosene heater. The wick of the match fell into the rug below, which was saturated with kerosene, and started to go up in flames. In a panic, she attempted to roll up the rug to remove it from the structure. She accidentally knocked over the kerosene heater, which was quite heavy, about 80 pounds or so. When she attempted to pick that up, she got kerosene on her clothing. She herself went up in flames. In agony, she had to leave her 3 young children on the bed to run out of the structure and roll around in the mud in the hopes of dousing the flames. Within seconds, the building went up in flames. The 3 children perished, and Dilcia Trent suffered burns on 80% of her body. She died 1 week later. These stories were all too common, again, through poverty, also workers forced to take chances. There came dangerous camps and dwellings, and operators cut chances, and it just went on. 2 babies in 1950. A family of 4 lived in a chicken coop in Bridgehampton. And I'll say that again, it's worth reporting. A chicken coop they lived in Bridgehampton, 4 of them. The 2 parents were out working in the fields. The 2 babies were stayed at the facility. A fire erupted. They perished. In the wake of that fire, the Bridgehampton Child Care Center was created by local people in Bridgehampton, which still stands today doing great work, but obviously in the wake of that terrible tragedy. I mentioned Dilcia Trent. In January of 1959, there were 8 deaths in 11 days. Again, all from these similar conditions. In 1961, I mentioned the Cutchogue campfire with four men who died because they couldn't afford the 75-cent cost in meals. 1968, the Jacobs campfire where Myrtle Lee Grant and 2 others perished when the door was reportedly nailed shut. 1982, a well-known but homeless man named Spanish McGee in Riverhead. He left the migrant stream and really was just homeless and well-known throughout the area. His body was found in a doorway of a rundown shack, accompanied by his 2 dogs, his only companions in life. So again, the book does cover these tragic tales, and it was important to capture their names to the extent I could find them and share them and preserve them for the record. But for not, they would not have been remembered. The book also covers outspoken critics who I've called better angels, who face scorn, ridicule, and even death threats for their efforts. All of these workers lobbied for better conditions. All of these advocates lobbied for better conditions. One of them, Reverend Arthur Bryant, a reverend from Greenport and Southold. He was a staunch advocate for migrant workers. He testified before Congress in 1969. He appeared regularly on television and radio programs, and for all his efforts, he faced death threats because he was fighting for the workers. Mary Chase Stone, a woman who left a life of luxury in New England and dedicated a life in Riverhead to fight for migrant workers. She won several court cases on behalf of the workers to retrieve monies that were owed to them. She formed a nonprofit called Long Island Volunteers, which was the first nonprofit group on Long Island to receive federal funding for a migrant program. In fact, if you mentioned earlier, if you recall, I mentioned the incident with Alfonso Mahone. Mary Chase Stone and Long Island Volunteers were the group to were able to procure a ride home for him and get the Department of Labor to get the money back. There were many other acts from the clergy to federal volunteers. The health department inspectors did their best, and they too faced threats and violence. And a large part of it was from the strict no trespassing laws that were applied at the time, and many of the farmers and growers clung to. And camp operators, they hated the idea of anyone visiting the camps, reporting on the camps, and thus they denied access to them. And when people did show up, this often led to violent encounters. In the late 1960s, a young reporter, Carl Grossman, who today is a professor and a reporter out in Southampton, he was a young reporter at the time. He was photographing a camp. He was attending the camp with an assemblyman. And one of the camp operators picked up a 2x4 piece of wood, hit Carl over the head, cut him open badly, and sent him to the hospital. Others were reportedly threatened with shotguns and other types of violence. And this was going on for many years, and really went on until approximately 1971, When access to the labor camps was finally won, it was a federal court case. Judge Fox in Michigan stated, property ownership does not vest the owner with dominion over the lives of the people living on his property. At the time, and the judge, it was the first federal case to allow nonprofit groups like reporters, social justice groups, and labor unions to visit the farms and report on the conditions and try to help make things better. The end of the era, I would love to tell you that there was some public push, some good ending here, but it wasn't. It was largely, this era ended from the agricultural changes, primarily the increased usage of machinery, which led to decreased need for manpower, which led to need for less labor camps, and also the decrease in the potato production. In 1954, there were 45,000 acres of potatoes planted. By 1997, less than 6,000 acres. At the same time, there was a sharp increase in land values. As we all know, the values of out in the Both Forks extremely expensive. And many farmers were cashing out. They had their own struggles to contend with. And by 1971, 1/3 of the county's 68,000 farms are owned by real estate prospectors. And eventually those real estate prospectors sold the land to what would become the modern day vineyard owners. I had a great conversation with Louisa Hargrave. Her and her husband were the first on Long Island to create a vineyard, Hargraves in Cutchogue. And she explained that she purchased that land off a prospector who purchased that land off a potato farmer. And as far as the historical legacy, I'll leave that to the reader to decide, but certainly there was enough blame to go around, from the crew leaders to the growers to the public and even the ineffective government. But in short, this is just another sad example of industry, where an industry was valued far greater than human lives. The book is called Long Island Migrant Labor Camps, Dust for Blood. It was released on March 22nd, published by the History Press, also available on Amazon and bookstores. And I welcome any questions you may have. If anyone has questions, please let me know.
All right, so I don't think we have any questions, Mark. That was a great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. And again, feel free to, if anyone has follow-up questions, they can email you or James and you can forward it to me. And thank you for attending. I appreciate all interest.
All right. Yep. Thank you. And we hope to see you here again, Mark.
Yes.
Everybody, this will be on YouTube in a couple of days. If you have any questions regarding the program, contact Jim Ward.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mark.
Take care.